Welcome to Sociology. Burger, do you want fries with it?
Today we are diving deep into a genre that, let's be honest, often gets completely dismissed as intellectual junk food. Fantasy fiction.
Right.
I mean, if you've ever read a dense critique, you've probably heard the argument that fantasy is inherently escapist, just decorative fluff designed to take your mind off the real world.
And that dismissal is really the hook for this deep dive. We have a fascinating stack of literary theory, of political critique, that argues the exact opposite. It argues that for a specific strain of radical writers, we're talking Marxists, socialists, anarchists, fantasy, is actually a highly potent, almost a surgical tool for social and political critique.
So our central mission today is to unpack that very accusation. You know, the idea that fantasy is this limiting, commodified form that just justifies the commodity capitalism of the status quo. We're asking, how can the literature of, I don't know, dragons and magic actually function as a liberating force for ideological critique?
Okay, let's unpack this central philosophical concept right away. The radical theorists you've shared with us, particularly Mark Bould, say the real power of fantasy lies in its inherent undecidability. What does that even mean in simple terms?
It means that fantasy is basically founded on a consciousness of the impossible. And because it deals in the impossible, it sort of constantly exists in this twilight zone where you can't decisively label it.
Okay.
Bould argues that fantasy is perpetually undecidable between being, say, subversive, actively challenging the norm, or being merely mystificatory and reactionary, just confusing the issue, or even justifying old prejudices.
So if I'm understanding this, that very ambiguity, that inability to pin it down as either like a political manifesto or just mindless pulp, is precisely what gives it its critical power.
Exactly. That's the key. If it were just a clear political pamphlet, it would be limiting. But because it's constantly defying a fixed meaning, it can be mobilized against codified reality, against the rigid definitions imposed by the state or by capital. That ambiguity, it's its greatest weapon.
And these are not fringe voices we're talking about. We're looking at 5 major writers who have used all these diverse modes of the fantastic, from pulp heroes and magic realism to modern superhero comics, to express explicitly radical left positions.
Yeah, we're talking about Michael Moorcock, Angela Carter, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, and China Miéville.
That heavy-hitting lineup.
But before we jump into their work, we have to acknowledge this foundational tension that kind of dogs all politically committed art. Our sources really highlight the conflict between a utilitarian, politically committed impulse and a purely aesthetically oriented one. And that tension creates a real friction for the reader and the critic.
And there's a great historical example of that conflict in the sources, right? The writer Louis Ferdinand Céline.
Absolutely. Céline was a gifted, incredibly innovative writer, but he was also a virulent fascist.
Wow.
So the Surrealists, for example, condemned his writing because they felt his aesthetics were fundamentally contaminated by his reactionary politics.
But then you have figures like Trotsky, who looked at the very same work and argued that Céline's aesthetic interests were so profound that they actually elevated his fiction above his toxic politics.
It's a classic negotiation, isn't it? And that stance is echoed by the contemporary Marxist writer China Miéville, who said directly, "I don't judge fiction writers by their politics. Louis Ferdinand Céline was scum, but a superb writer."
So that really sets the stage for our deep dive. How do these authors balance the political demand for change with the artistic demand for compelling, sometimes messy fiction?
Let's find out.
Let's jump in with Michael Moorcock and the concept of anarchic pluralism. Moorcock's political framework is pure left anarchist, heavily influenced by Peter Kropotkin, who defined anarchism not as chaos, but as the flourishing of voluntary organizations and a focus on mutual aid over competition.
And Moorcock blends that Kropotkin vision with the avant-garde spirit of the New Left, specifically the situationists who focused on the revolution of everyday life.
Oh, right.
For the situationists, the political struggle wasn't just in the factories or parliaments, it was in reclaiming joy and play and imagination in your daily existence.
So how does that very specific political stance translate to something like Elric of Melniboné and the multiverse?
Well, it completely dictates the structure of his fantasy worlds. Moorcock's heroes are typically these estranged noblemen, often anti-heroes, who are constantly fighting against the idea of a fixed ultimate reality. They're driven by the anarchist ideal of no gods, no masters.
Right.
His narratives consistently show that, and this is a quote, gods and heroes and grand designs are shown to be pointless because they are inherently hierarchical and rigid.
So if the political demand is to dismantle singular, fixed authority, you need a fictional aesthetic tool to express unending variety.
And that's where the multiverse comes in.
Enter the multiverse.
Precisely. It started as just a pulp motif, a way to link all his heroic narratives together, but it quickly evolved into this very sophisticated political formulation. The multiverse acts as an aesthetic tool that unifies realist narratives and even surrealist aesthetics by treating them as alternate, equally valid universes.
And that unity on an equal plane is the key, isn't it? It means no single reality gets privileged.
It's an explicit statement of unending plurality and development. This framework stands anarchically against any kind of monoculture, be that phallocentrism, ethnocentrism, or just the idea of a central governing authority. It really reflects Kropotkin's vision of overlapping non-territorial affinity groups rather than one singular power structure trying to unify everyone under one flag.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so if Moorcock uses plurality to contest hierarchy, let's shift to Angela Carter, who used the aesthetics of disruption. We're looking at her work as a late version of surrealism, driven by her socialist and feminist positions and deeply influenced by the time she spent observing Japanese culture.
And her choice of surrealism is inherently political. Herbert Reed, a major theorist of the movement, argued that surrealism was the only true application of the principles of dialectical materialism.
Oh, that sounds dense.
It does, but what he meant was that it was the only artistic form attempting to unify the internal world. So, dreams, desire, imagination, and the external material world into a single, cohesive totality of human experience.
So it's not just about painting melting clocks.
Yeah.
It's a real attempt to break down the barrier between what we imagine and what we actually live.
It is. It's a revolutionary attempt to find the beyond of the immediately real. And Carter operationalizes this political project through techniques of surrealist rupture, specifically using doubling and inversion. She takes the expected codified reality and just brutally flips it on its head.
The prime example being The Passion of New Eve, where traditional gendered expectations are violently disrupted.
Absolutely. The male protagonist is forced to undergo objectification, humiliation, and trauma, the very experiences traditionally reserved for female characters in literature. It's a complete structural and thematic reversal.
And the villain, Mother, explicitly states her revolutionary purpose in these dialectical terms.
Yeah.
She declares her intention to perform a surrealist assault on the symbolic order of patriarchy, stating that, and I'm quoting here, "Woman has been the antithesis in the dialectic of creation quite long enough."
I mean, it's an overt declaration of political intent embedded in a fantastical, almost Gothic structure.
That kind of direct political language within the fiction just confirms that for these writers, the fantastic is a means to an end.
Exactly. So let's transition from Carter's disruptive dream logic to China Miéville, who anchors the fantastic directly in hard Marxist materialism.
Miéville is one of the writers who most directly confronts that accusation we started with.
Yeah.
That fantasy is inherently escapist compared to, say, science fiction.
He does. He argues that fantasy is inherent in human productive activity itself. He uses that famous quote from Marx about the architect. If you recall, Marx says that even the worst of architects conceives the ideal structure in their mind before they ever build it in reality.
Ah, that's the crux of his argument.
Yeah.
Labor itself is predicated on a consciousness of the not real. The fantastic isn't something external we run away to. It's already there in the most mundane moment of building a chair or designing a wall.
And this materialist foundation allows his fantastic metaphors in his Bas-Lag novels to function as really precise social critiques. Let's look at The Remade.
Okay.
These are victims of state punishment where the body is grotesquely deformed through forced biological surgery.
The sources detail the visceral horror of this. Victims forced to live with, like babies' arms grafted onto their face, or with machinery fused right into their limbs.
And that grotesque physical transformation is not just shock value. It's a brilliant, horrible allegory for ideological control. The Remade are a racialized underclass, permanently branded by the state's power to punish and define. Their deformity is a political marker.
And the revolutionary potential comes when they transform into the free-made autonomous, independent subjects who reject that state-imposed definition. It's a physical revolutionary shift in their subjectivity.
Miéville reinforces this idea of contradictory elements, creating a political whole through characters like the gangster Mr. Motley. His body is this fantastic totality. He's got tiger eyes, a monkey paw, fragments of different creatures, all existing in what's described as an uneasy truce.
So Motley's body acts as a sort of microcosm of his city, New Crobuzon. It's this incredibly complex hybrid social matrix.
And his physical reality, this collage of disjunctive parts, defies the state's power to punish him through remaking. He's already a surrealist collage. His body resists being reduced to a singular, state-defined entity. By being a totality of contradictions, he becomes unclassifiable and, crucially, he's outside the state's power.
That's a powerful transition from the body as an object of state control to the body as an act of resistance. Let's shift modes entirely and unpack the politics of the superhero, starting with Alan Moore, the writer who famously took the genre and just elevated it into high critique.
Moore is essential here because he directly addresses that accusation of escapism. He argues that fantasy isn't frivolous, but a form of cognitive estrangement, the process of making the familiar strange, and that this process is central to human experience.
And he frames the superhero not as a literal savior, but as a surrogate for what Keats called the chameleon poet, the artistic personality that can immerse itself in and even relish the dark side of things without being destroyed by them.
Exactly. Look at V for Vendetta. This was a direct political response to Thatcherism in the UK. Moore took the anxiety of the 1980s and just extrapolated it into a fascist future, which requires a hero, but a deeply problematic anti-status hero.
And V's strategy is pure, radical, and archic symbolism.
Yeah.
The Guy Fawkes mask is the centerpiece.
Mm-hmm.
It creates an impenetrable anarchic persona that refuses to be fixed by authority.
Right.
The authorities are desperately searching for V's true identity. Was he Jewish, homosexual, black? But his identity is withheld.
He is an everyman figure precisely because he is no man. He represents the negation of authority. V is an idea, not a person. He is the idea of resistance.
But isn't that position politically dangerous? I mean, if V is only an idea, how does that translate to real-world political action? Doesn't the focus on symbolism risk making the act purely aesthetic?
That's the exact tension Moore is exploring. V is destroyed, but the idea, the memory, is passed on. His final message is that there's no flesh or blood under this cloak. There's only an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. Moore acknowledges the tragedy of physical death, but asserts the permanence of the symbolic political act.
That's a heavy act of symbolism. Moore's contemporary, Grant Morrison, takes this idea of symbolism and kicks it into high-gear absurdity, often inflected by situationism to critique commodity culture.
Morrison uses the superhero genre to directly contest Guy Debord's theory of the society of the spectacle. For Debord, modern life is entirely mediated by images, by brands, by commodity culture. Everything is a representation, not a reality. And Morrison saw the modern superhero mega-event as the ultimate spectacle.
So he uses absurd fantasy to undermine the seriousness of the spectacle. I love the example from his Doom Patrol run. There's this cosmic threat, the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, named Extinction.
And extinction is terrifying because it gains power by feeding on fixed intellectual and artistic movements like surrealism and futurism. It's literally the death of imagination through codification.
But how is this universe-ending threat defeated?
The Doom Patrol steers extinction into the Dada world. Dadaism was the movement that rejected all logic and reason.
Right.
When extinction, which relies on fixed meaning, enters the space of pure, pointless absurdity, it is rendered powerless and literally transformed into a hobby horse, which is the literal translation of the word Dada, just sitting inertly next to Superman.
That's just fantastic.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, but it's profoundly strategic. It shows that fixed ideology can be neutralized by unreason.
He does something similar in Animal Man. When a massive crossover event culminates in an alien doomsday device, a seismic poem about to destroy the universe, the protagonist just walks up and switches it off.
Just turns the plot device off.
Yes. That single, simple gesture is a powerful counter-ideological statement. It shows how the aesthetic demands of the genre, the need for endless, spectacular, world-ending drama conflict, with the political demand for immediate, rational change. Morrison is saying, through this metafictional intervention, that irony trumps drama and political consciousness must override the demands of rigid genre continuity.
So we've covered anarchic plurality, surrealist rupture, Marxist allegory, and metafictional anti-spectacle. What does this dense landscape of radical fantasy ultimately mean for you, the listener?
It means that the accusation of escapism just fundamentally misses the point. The common thread through all five of these radical voices is their strategic use of dualism, this constant tension between fantasy and anti-fantasy, between the ideal and the material, to expose the contradictions of the real world.
And this tension, as we established right at the beginning, it isn't a failure of the literary form. It's a necessary strategy for political engagement, forcing the reader to constantly evaluate which reality they are currently standing in.
They are deliberately using contrary perspectives. The wildest escapist fantasy positioned right next to the grimmest material realism to generate a deeper, necessary insight. Alan Moore actually provided the perfect metaphor for this strategy in his work, Black Dossier.
He describes the blazing world, which is the immaterial realm of the fictive and the imagination, as being drawn in red-green 3D.
Exactly. Moore suggests that this 3D image illustrates how combining two unique, contrary perspectives, like the political commitment, represented by the red lens, and the necessary aesthetic distance, represented by the green lens, doesn't create distortion, but generates a third perspective of depth and solidity that allows us to see the entire picture.
It's an assertion that the immaterial realm of imagination, the blazing world, is just as permanent and venerable as the material world. The two are constantly creating one another.
Which brings us back to what Shakespeare's Prospero says in Moore's work, a really powerful synthesis. The imagination is a shared space where, and I'm quoting, "the fantasies thou fashioned fashion thee."
That's a memorable takeaway. The act of imagining new realities actually changes the reality you inhabit.
And this raises an important final question, which M. John Harrison identified when discussing this persistent anti-fantasy dialectic. He says it's not a failure of form, but a consequence of seeking engagement through the form. So how do you view your own daily attempts to escape or critique the pressures of modern life? Are you seeking pure aesthetic distance, or are you actually engaging in committed political action simply by imagining a different, better reality? Something to ponder until our next deep dive.